Hey everybody, this is my first journal for Digital Rhetoric and Literacy with Dr. Banks. So the two pieces that we had this week were Haas and Iman. Haas looked to introduce us to digital rhetoric and also see how it could be parsed apart and pullen apart as well. Two things I found particularly interesting was the looking into the queering of digital rhetoric and its space. Queering is a different look at it. So queering as in terms of queer rhetorics, but also in disabilities as well, disability studies as well. So looking at people like Yergo has looked at a lot of things with neurotypicalness and looking how we can clear that, specifically with autism. But as I've been looking into her pieces as well, that can be, I believe, mitigated with other disabilities such as speech impediments and stuttering. So looking into that, and then also covered Brenda Jo Brueggemann as well, tying in those key pillars of disability studies. And the Iman piece looked at digital rhetoric, looked to define it, and then also looked to define other things that are cross-disciplinary, close to digital rhetoric, and intertwine at some places. So looked at technological rhetoric, looked at new media, visual rhetoric, and also like digital cultural rhetoric, and asking if those two are the same or not the same. So I became interested with looking at all those different things and seeing if digital rhetoric can also be defined as something that is not interacting with what you would term as a traditional digital interface, what we would think of as computers. The author did talk about technological rhetoric, focusing on things like as Braille and Morse code. So those go out of that digital platform, but there's a lot of discussion in the chapter about how digital rhetoric looks to how they connect. So how like things like that hard information and like the interface connect. So looking at, I began to think, well, what if we think of like a hard drive and an interface very differently and very abstractly, which I think of things abstractly in terms of theory. I worked a lot with tactile objects in my master's program. I looked at institutional mental health, specifically asylum architecture, and how we can open up those identities of patients that haven't been told by looking at the architecture that's been left behind. So I looked a lot at actor network theory with Bruno Latour. I looked at object-oriented ontology and how to bring that our connectedness to objects. I looked a lot at Sarah Ahmed with her queer phenomenology and our placement and distance to and from objects and how that affects us, how that affects our interactions with things and connectiveness. And then I also looked at Foucault as well, and looked at the panopticon and things. So what I've been thinking is how we can think of theory as that connectiveness, between like the hard drive and the interface. So could that be digital? And I could be completely off, but I was thinking when I was reading it, when I look at like things like, I'm really interested in the rhetoric of objects and things that they hold and things that you really have to suss out, that are almost coded in the objects and how they can tell those stories. So, like how buildings over time have wear and tear. If they're in something, there's scratches on hardwood floors. There's chips in paint. There's outside other wear on bricks, and how the coating on that, how that damage put together as codes helps to show us a story. So how that hard drive, how that coding on the hard drive, and thinking of like a building as a hard drive, how that all comes together with those codes of those like damages and tells us a story of the individuals at the institution. So looking at technology in that way, I could be completely off pace, but I think that's interesting. How that interconnects. And I've been also thinking of things in terms of objects as well. When we have ourselves, so just think of like our person as a hard drive with all that information inside, and then how we express ourselves through our home, like in my apartment, in places we live, in our offices, how that interface is coded. So thinking of our places we live, things that we own, seeing that collectiveness as interface, and then all the individual things that we own and how they're placed as all codes, and adding all those codes up, we can start to paint a picture, which I think is a way that we can begin to think of a non-traditional digital platform as almost digital rhetoric, because we're thinking of it in that same type of context by coding things from a hard drive that go into an interface. I'm still trying to think through a lot of this. A lot of this is kind of like coming into my mind. So that's where I'm really interested is, so I have like to think of the idea where like our brain and our person on the inside is that hard drive, and our home, or the place we live, the place like that holds everything else, is the interface, and then all the individual objects in it are pieces of the code. So I love reading, so therefore it's that love of reading is shown through all my books that I have, and I love I have a deep connection to family, so I have a lot of family photos up. I love to cook, so there's a lot of kitchen gadgets and things in there. I have 2 diplomas up, So those diplomas look at education. I have things up somewhere. So that indicates that I've traveled, or indicates a love for travel, or indicates a love for things outside of the United States. So thinking about like how all of these individual things pushed out of my hard drive into these codes, then put together in the interface, which is my home, begins to tell a story. And I think that can be translated into the work that I was doing with the mental health institutions and asylums, trying to look at the architecture to open that story up of inmates that hadn't been told. So looking at the abandoned buildings, looking at what was still left in them, how they were treated, if they were still there, if they were torn down, the wear and tear that they have, the artifacts left. So putting all of those codes left on the hard drive, which the hard drive I would think of like as the building, and then the interface would be like all of the would be the whole picture of the of how it is now. So putting that story all together, so the interface being that story of what happened by putting all the little pieces together. So that's what I've been really thinking out of the box. Don't be concerned if you get confused by what I'm saying, because I don't quite understand fully myself yet. If I'm going completely crazy. Well, not crazy, but these ideas are different and they're a little bit jumbled in my head. Yeah. I think that's probably it for this week. I was just thinking about those different things and wanted to talk through them. And that's why I am choosing a digital platform for my journal, because, well, I like to be able to talk fluently through my ideas, and if I'm journaling or recording myself talk, I don't stutter as much. So it's nice to be able to have a time where I'm not stuttering as much, and use a different way of communicating instead of writing all the time. I love writing, but this is a good way for me to really think through ideas in a more fluid situation where I can just like let it out more easily. So see you later, and be ready for number 2 next week.